Hi, Tom. If you could tell us what is acceptance and commitment therapy helpful for?
Yep. So what is acceptance and commitment therapy helpful for? It's helpful for a whole manner of things. It's used for generalized anxiety, it's used for depression. It's also been used in relationship counseling with youth services as well. And the way that I used it primarily, and the way that I assume Mummy Star would be using it as well, is looking at people affected by cancer. So a lot of my examples are going to be linked back to my experiences of going through the training course with people affected by cancer, but also looking at generalized anxiety and just general overthinking as well. And it's it works because it gives people the opportunity to use their own resources, their own faculties, and their own understanding of life to try and move forward with their life as well. And it's not something that is it's not given to you. It's something that you need to work out. It's something that, using your point of reference and your background, you're able to then determine what steps you need to take to move forward in your life. So it can become something that's very niche and very focused on what the individual is going through, which I think is brilliant. And that it's so different for every single person. So as much as people might have a similarly named diagnosis, the way that we approach that diagnosis and the way that our experiences are going to shift our mindset as to how we deal with that diagnosis is going to be something that's very individual, and ACT can tailor itself to ensure that it helps you through your circumstances. Um, so the way that we used it with Activate Your Life was that it was primarily designed for those that were directly impacted by cancer. And the way that we molded the course was to remind people that as much as they've had a cancer diagnosis, they've already lived a very fruitful, full life before receiving that cancer diagnosis. And what can often happen is that you lose your identity overnight because all of a sudden the diagnosis has changed. And particularly related to Mummy Star, from my understanding, is that not only are you going through a life-changing diagnosis, but you're already going through something life-changing in that there's some addition to your family. There's a change in your family dynamic which is happening already. And it often goes overlooked that we go through many big life changes all of the time. So when we start being old enough to realize who we are as children, and then we move to secondary school, and then we might move out to the family home, and then we have families, and then we have jobs. These are all very large changes that happen to us. But the way that they're perceived in public is this is good news. So we don't tend to worry about them too much, unless generalized anxiety takes over and you think, I don't feel well equipped to deal with this. And increasing that awareness that we've already gone through big life changes is actually really helpful in looking at this other big change, which can be negative. More on that a little bit later, because some of the feedback that we had is that, yes, it was negative to begin with, but through opening up and actually talking and asking questions actually leads people to open up their dialogue and their discussions with other people, including their friends and family. And ACT, in the context that we used it over a 4-week period, is that week one they'd come by themselves because they didn't necessarily want to have help, but then they might bring their partner along or their children along. And what's really good about ACT and its non-judgmental nature, because we're just observing things. I say the word just. It's me. I don't like the word just, but it's us equating these thoughts that just happen to just thoughts that happen. And for me to use the word just shows that the thoughts aren't necessarily worth what they're made out of. And we don't even know what they're made out of. But when you bring someone with you and you're having this non-judgmental conversation about how you're feeling and why you're feeling it, and being mindful and present in the moment, is that all of a sudden you can start having conversations and you can start opening up your dialogue with this framework of, these are the thoughts that I'm having that might affect you. And that was the biggest learning curve for a lot of families when they undertook the ACT course, because it wasn't the thought being factual that you don't care about me anymore, for example, but I'm having the thought that you're not necessarily as attentive as you were before. Is there a reason for this? And all of a sudden, the accusations potential accusations are removed, because you're admitting that you're not saying you don't care about me anymore. You're saying I'm having the thought that things have changed. And then from that moment, you can open up that dialogue a little bit more and say, oh, well, it's funny you mentioned that, because I've had the thought that you didn't want me to talk to you as much as I did before. And once you can break down that barrier in a non-judgmental way, and without any accusations or any little remarks that might cause a bit of tension, then all of a sudden you've got this beautiful conversation that comes out of it, and a very open one that hopefully there will be a resolution and there won't be conflict, and you can dedicate time space to it. Because from my experience, the person that's got the diagnosis is arguably the person that does the most well with it, because after so long, you do accept that there is nothing you can do about it. So you're stuck in that situation, but those caring for you, they don't know how you're feeling, really. And it all comes down to conversation. But if you then undergo treatment, and all of a sudden you might be thinking different thoughts, and you're tired and you're exhausted, and then all of a sudden someone says, how are you feeling today? And you might snap back by accident, how do you think I'm feeling? So that person is no longer going to ask you questions. They're going to start drifting away. And when they start drifting away, you stop asking how they're doing in return. So all of a sudden you've got two people that are just drifting away, because you don't have that safe space to actually communicate. And this is where that understanding of your thoughts versus fact are so important, because now you can say, if someone does snap back, get my hands right, if someone does snap back because they're undergoing treatment and they're exhausted and they're tired, what the other person can do, because there's a responsibility on both of you to come back and say, I've had the thought that you necessarily didn't like me asking that question the other day. Was it specific to that day, or is there something else that you want to talk about? And then with that courage to ask that question in the first place, because no one wants to deliberately cause upset, particularly when you're undergoing something traumatic or as a significant change, then you can start having this reciprocal conversation, which is really, really cool. And you can start having those moments together where you can be mindful in the moment and not thinking about the bills that need to be paid, thinking about how we're going to tell family members, how are we going to explain this to so-and-so. It doesn't matter, because you're in that moment. And then I mentioned it earlier in the first question about helpful and unhelpful thoughts. So having that ability to understand that not all thoughts are equal, and that some of them are really, really useless and unhelpful, is really important. So if you are going down a track of different thoughts, it's very easy to start having repeated thoughts that aren't helpful, and also catastrophizing things as well, where you take one small thing and it's like, this is the end of the world, and you start going off on a track. And the example that we had is, there might be a nice tomato on the table, and the tomato that's on the table looks really nice, and you think, oh, that's lovely. But what if the tomato was to fall? And if it falls off the table, it's going to be on the floor, and then it's going to be a hazard. And if someone steps on that tomato, they might slip, because tomatoes are wet. And if they slip, they might bump their head. And if they bump their head, then they might not wake back up again. They might die because of that tomato that's on the table. And it sounds ludicrous to say that as deadpan as I just have then, but some people do have these thoughts where they think, if that's going to happen, then that will inevitably lead to step 10, which in our case was a nice looking tomato on a table is going to end up killing someone. And being able to disrupt those thoughts and take them for what they are, which is just a narrative, it's a story that our brain is making up, is a really important way that we can use ACT to stop getting too far ahead of ourselves. And one of the cancer types that I dealt with was prostate cancer. And to monitor prostate cancer, you have your PSA test, and you have this reading. And if you have one test, the results are good stuff, the number's really low. Then you might go back a couple months later and it's rised a little bit. It might be like a tiny, tiny rise. And some people will be like, this is it. This is the beginning of the end. It's going to keep going up. It's going to keep going up. And they're on high alert for the whole time, waiting for the next test. Then it goes back down. It's like, oh, I worried for no reason. I bet I'll go up next time. And yet we end up just thinking so far into the future that it's just unhelpful. And also looking back far too far to different childhood traumas or different things that have happened to us that might be health related, and we start thinking, well, do you remember how bad that went? Well, this is exactly the same. And it's not exactly the same. Our circumstances change and they grow and they adjust with whatever is happening to us in that present moment. Another thing that ACT is really helpful for is once we understand our values. So we've looked at these recurring thoughts, we've looked at open dialogue, but also understanding who we want to be. Because if we don't have a direction in life, then what are we going to, like, what are we actually living for? Are we just here to exist, or are we here to have a fruitful life? And this is where having ACT and its values section and living a committed life is a really good way of giving us the courage and the strength and the conviction to actually do something with the life that we have. And it might be sharing your story. It might be undertaking new hobbies or crafts. It might be being more available for your family. And you don't necessarily hear it as much these days, but kind of your midlife crisis for people that give up the high flying job in the city is almost someone having this epiphany that I'm not living in line with my values anymore. And having that strength to actually give up on things and say no to things that aren't helpful and say, this is how I want to live my life. And a really good way of assessing what values you want to live is look at the world around you, look at the people around you, and think of those people that you have great admiration for, that you have great respect for, and think, how are they living their life? And how will I know when I'm living a similarly aligned life? And getting a list of values from the internet and having a look through and like marking them out of 10 as like which ones are really important to you can really help you in saying no to things, because we spend so much of our life pandering to other people and saying yes, or yes, I'll sort that out, I'll sort this out, when actually we might have zero interest in it whatsoever. So having permission to say no based on your own guidance, based on your own navigation, is really, really crucial to being more content with your life. It won't necessarily lead to happiness, but you'll be more content, because you might not like letting people down. But if someone's asking you to do something that you have no interest in, or that you think, no, I'm focusing on myself today, I'm going to rest today, and that's really important to me because of the situation I'm in at the moment, then you say no. And no is a full sentence. You don't have to give justification just because. And your brain, depending on how you're hardwired, will go into overdrive. And it's like, I can't believe you said that. They must think you're really horrible now. You're going to have to make up for that when you next see them. But these are just thoughts that happen. And you can talk to those thoughts and you'll be like, I don't feel happy about what I've just done, but I know I will tomorrow when I'll have a little bit more energy to spend time with my family and not with whoever was asking that first request. So having that balance is really, really important. And then using mindfulness and staying in the present is just a really nice place to be. I've already talked about the flash forwards, and I've talked about the rewinds where we bring up things from our past and worrying about catastrophizing and what can happen next. But there's something really nice about just taking time for yourself and just being really mindful in the moment, and just being aware of like the texture of the clothes on your skin, whether there's any nice scents around you. Have you lit a candle that's that's scented? What are you eating? Can you really taste all the flavors that are around you? And have you ever found yourself in a moment that you think, wow, this is actually really beautiful? And have you actually sat in that moment and enjoyed that moment a little bit longer? Or are you still busy rushing off? Oh, we got to get there, we got to get there. When actually there's so much happening here. You don't need to be flying off. You could just be sat enjoying. You could be enjoying that breath and how it feels to relax your shoulders for once. I've been talking hunched over to you. And it's like, oh, actually, yeah, I feel quite content now. I'm going to have a sip of my hot drink. I'm going to smell, if it's coffee, you're going to smell all those different aromas. And then you're going to feel that liquid on your lip. Is it hot? Is it gone warm? Is it tepid? Is it milky? And then once it falls past your tongue and it goes down your throat, can you feel it fill you up? Does it make you feel warm? It was quite icy here this morning. So holding a cup of tea in my hand was lovely. You could feel it radiating from the inside out. Another thing that you could do just to be really mindful is look at the palm of your hand. And if you just spent 60 seconds looking at the palm of your hand, you'll recognize things that you've never even seen before. And yet you live with it every single day. When was the last time you just stopped to look and appreciate what it is that we have around you? Even though things might be crumbling or falling down around us, there's always a moment that you can sit back and be like, actually, I can still see all these things. I can still hear all these things. I can still smell all these things. And that's really wonderful to be able to take that moment just to have a bit of a full stop and be like, I'm here now. And then what am I going to do next? And that's really important.